how these ideas move. We'll talk about that in a second, but you were going to ask a question?
No, I was just like, I thought Delhi was like more of like a tourist place and less of a place where like most of middle class India consumes like their market goods.
It is a tourist spot, but it's also where Indians go to buy their Indians of a particular socioeconomic class, but also Indians with a particular set of social cultural capital go to. Many of our my Indian colleagues from here go and purchase their artwork for their homes, perhaps from there, or their doormats, or their bedroom duvets, stuff like that, right?
Would that be just because they can, or is it because they feel like they're obliged to and they should? As like a
You're hitting on something. Have you guys read the global yoga paper I put on the reading list? No, okay, read it. If I get time, I'll come to that. Yes. So, okay, I'll try and answer that. I'm just conscious of time.
Okay, you can come back.
Yeah, because I can. Yeah, I'll think about that. Okay, so here's something. To be able to perform this, you actually have to know about it, right? That's a truism, but you actually have to be aware of what these things mean. What's this Indian student doing here when he's taking this picture with this brand? This is iPhone 6, right? I got it first. Do you think in Australia, Apple would actually produce a slogan, I got it first, right? I got it first. I don't think Apple would be as successful in Australia if the slogan, their brand, or one of their brand slogans, worked around that particular phrase. But here in India, this is important for this particular type of consumer.
But Apple still does, like in Australia, market to that kind of getting it first.
Yes, it does.
It doesn't do it as
explicitly. Yes, that's right. And if you go back in my brand management classes here and in Australia, I actually show a television commercial around that. But yeah, you're right. But not so explicitly. We'd just go, oh, we're not like that. We're more subtle, but we still want it first. Think about the ways that you perhaps, now Carlsberg is a very well-known consumer brand here, right? Particularly amongst the affluent urban consumer who has a certain level of taste and inverted commas, taste and also cultural capital. But the ways they drink it, and I'm actually currently doing a study actually in Delhi. You've been to Connaught Place? Connaught Place, some of you have. Connaught Place is it's considered, I think, the world's third or world's fifth most expensive retail space. It's in central Delhi. It is the center of Delhi, geographically as well. And if you're interested in how consumers in India behave, go to Connaught Place, and the inner and outer circles are interesting. It's built, the Connaught Place is built in the style of, what do you call it? I've forgotten, in Bath. Anyone been to Bath in England? No? Okay. Same style of architecture. And you'll see high-end boutiques, bars. There's one called the United Coffee House, for example. If you can, just walk in there. If you've got some free time, walk in there, have a tea or coffee. It might be a bit more expensive. I don't generally go and spend much money in there, but it's nice to go and observe this new emerging middle class, or perhaps even already emerged Indian middle class, and how they behave and what brands what brands they perform, right? That's the phrase I use, right? And then just 3 doors down, you'll see an upstairs bar where the newly emerged Indian middle class goes, right? And what brands they perform. The same, perhaps the same brands, but they use them in very different ways. And the meanings are different, right? Okay. Okay, so this is a bit of a summary slide. India's being middle class is expressed through the practices and values of a social group linked to economic, social, and cultural capital, right? And it's important to understand those three dimensions of the groups you're looking at. If anyone's planning to understand consumer groups, target markets here in India, if you might go on to engage with India in a more practical, business-oriented sense, it's not just about economic capital as my stats show. It's about understanding what are the nuances, right, about how consumer artifacts, and by that I mean products, services, brands, ideas as well, how they're used. Now they're structured, this is a term I haven't used before, you might have come across this, is structured through this idea of the lived experience. In other words, contextually driven. How does it feel and mean for me to use a particular brand in this context right now, given the various levels of cultural, social, economic capital that I have, right? And when I say context, I mean social contexts with my friends, differentiating practices against others as well, okay? The values, I mentioned this before, so I'll skip through it. The values that are attached to these sorts of practices are those around respectability, specific. Now I'm talking, this is a big broad brush, big broad brush. I mean, India's 1.2 billion people, but specific gender relations and ideas about the family. Family is huge. Family is all-encompassing here. The idea of family and marriage, and be seen to be married and to be seen to produce kids. And many of you in Australia who have had engagement with, say, Indian international students will know that the value of education is huge here as well. Massive, massive. And education is linked to social mobility, right? I'm not going to talk about the last point, I've already talked about that before, but let's just talk about some ways through which this is expressed. And I put these slides here because I was thinking, okay, you guys are all undergrads? Yeah, you're all undergrads. So I'm looking at my undergrads here, right? The cool, funky things that I teach brand management to and so on. And what do they wear? Now, is Pepe Jeans, I've been out of Australia and I'm more than twice your age, I think. Is Pepe Jeans familiar for you guys? That is so interesting, right? Because here it is everything amongst your set. If you guys were studying here, it is everything. And it's not like as in, it's actually a refined brand, but it's those who have access to the brand can use the brand, right? I'm thinking, I don't want to talk about what brands might be prominent for you guys. I mean, I don't even want to attempt that. I do it badly in my Australian classrooms so what brands in Australia do you know, say for 20 to 25, 20 to 23, let's say? Are you clothing brands? Yeah, okay. So this is main. So I'm just trying to think of an equivalent because I can't connect with. Pepe was a brand that I used 25 years ago in Melbourne. It was hot in Melbourne. It died, and it's obviously still died. But it's been revitalized in the global India. And for good reason. There's a massive consumer market here. And it's what not everyone here wears, but those with, I would say, cultural capital wear here. Does that make sense? So I'm just trying to think of an equivalent brand in Australia. It's subtle. It's not like the big Polo Ralph Lauren's, you know, insignias or small that you'd see, you know.
Is Zara
It's not Zara. It's not Zara. Yeah.
Like general pants.
No, probably not. Oh, it's a bit higher. It's higher than General Pants. The reason I put that, yeah, it's a bit higher than General Pants. It's a bit more refined.
Like Levi's?
No. Oh, sorry?
Just James?
No, no.
So we can't, you're not thinking of something international.
It is an international, it's a UK brand. I can't talk about what you guys wear and because I've been out of the Australian classroom for 2 years, right? And I've been in, but this brand expresses very much an Indian upper middle class sensibility. Anyone been to Khan Market? Right? Now, Khan Market expresses the same sensibility. In fact, has anyone been to Hoscars here? Not yet. So you are going. Okay, Hoscars, you'll know if you go. Hoscars, Khan Market, they're two different places. It's like saying Newtown and, what's the place north of Crow's Nest? Yeah, it's a bit like, Neutral Bay and, yeah. But Khan Market is arguably the upscale shopping strip. It's a market here in Delhi. And again, it's where a certain type of middle class consumer goes to purchase and shop. And it's interesting, if you do go there, interesting to watch their practices and how they behave and the cars that park and the sort of attitudes of the young 20-somethings there. It's really fascinating to watch because I'll come to you, they have a certain, like our students, they have a certain sort of, I own this place.
What about Central Market?
Central Market in Delhi. Not quite. Yeah, have you been here?
Yeah, I've been here.
Oh.
I was just kind of wondering because that was a very strange experience.
Yeah, not quite like what I'm describing. But certainly it is there for the emerging middle class. Yeah. You'd have to have cultural capital, a certain level of capital to access this.
You have a Melbourne equivalent?
Of Khan Market?
No, not the one Jackie said, the one you were talking about before, the Neutral Bay one.
Oh, Neutral Bay. Yeah, Melbourne.
Chadstone.
No, I'd say no. Hawkersburn, near Armadale. In other words, it's very local and you have to know it. You're not going to see it on a tourist map, although this is on the tourist map. If you visit delhitourism.co.in, this will be there, but Hawkersburn won't be, right?
Camberwell Junction?
Yeah, there's an equivalent. Okay, here's another one. Anyone heard of Royal Enfield? Oh, you have. Oh, bugger. You haven't. Okay, so, sorry?
What is that?
Is it it's a brand of motorcycle, yes. So I was familiar with Royal Enfield, but I didn't realize how big. It's a brand of motorcycle for those who aren't familiar. Its roots are British. It was sold off to an Indian consortium. I can't remember now. I did my homework on this. It was sold off to an Indian consortium, and it's now manufactured and distributed and marketed from Chennai, right? So it's an Indian brand. It is an Indian brand now, but its roots are thoroughly English. And hence, it does well here. This, actually, I'm just going to, if I can, let me see if this works. Sometimes our infrastructure doesn't quite work here as well as it should. So this newspaper clipping comes from 2011. the Telegraph in the UK, and it talks about Triumph versus Royal Enfield, right? How both brands are entering in a big way. This is 2011, 7 years back. Entering in a big way the Indian market. Royal Enfield is no longer an English brand. It's not really found in England, or except in collectors' houses. But the reason they've done this is to go head to head and strongly, and both are thriving, might I say, is because they have realized that there's a massive, massive untapped potential here, potential here to tap into a consumer sentiment that wants things to show and display now that there's an increasing level of income. But also you have to have a certain type of cultural capital to access this brand. You have to first know about the brand, what its history is. You see Honda Hero. Honda Heroes here are ubiquitous. Royal Enfield is becoming, it's not ubiquitous, but it's popular amongst the middle class, whereas Honda Hero is pretty much the emerging middle class here in India the emerging Indian middle class would access Honda Hero motorbikes, it's transport, whereas this is actually not just transport, this is actually telling you something else about the person as well. Okay, so a couple of quick summary slides to talk about where we're at. As a result of perhaps liberalisation policies, this new consumer ethos that has permeated India, there's also media interest in, as we just saw, that was from an English newspaper, but similar stories abound in the Indian papers. We also see not just media interest, we also see official government interest. And now we're seeing academic interest in this idea of the role of consumption and consumerism as an ideology, on Indian society. And I keep coming back, as my second point says, those consumption experiences are intricately linked with the ideas of gender and family, often with the ideas of gender and family. Now we can cut down to subcultural groups and so on, but I'm giving you the broad brush here, not sort of the nuanced, finessed picture. And those linkages are also articulated to issues around caste, right? Which again, if I had to, from an outsider's perspective, if I had to sort of talk about two of the structuring cultural issues or dimensions here, I would have to talk about family and caste. And they're subtle, sometimes not so subtle, but they're subtle, but they're deeply structural. But what we're also seeing is it's not just that people are economically mobile, socially mobile and culturally mobile in terms of the sense of cultural capital and education and taste and practice. And they're junking. It's not just that as if they're junking the old ways. There's this idea, as the third point says, it's marked by continuities, right? How does a family who has increased their household wealth 10 times over the last, say, 10 years, and moved from a low middle, what in Australia we might call a lower middle class economic position, right, to a upper middle class economic position, right? How do they display their increase in status, increase in cultural capital through consumption practices, through the properties they buy, the holidays they spend on, the institutions they send their kids to, the cars they purchase, the brands now. I mean, we live in a globalized, this is a globalized, for want of a better word, this space here is a globalized India. There's not much difference except for pepper jeans. but there are differences, but there are also continuities with outside, and that global yoga paper touches on that. So here we are talking about consumption and being middle class. This is, I'm just going to talk about a little case study I came across a couple of weeks ago from the Indian state of Tamil Nadu. And in Tamil Nadu, there's a city called Coimbatore. And in Coimbatore, there's a particular caste called the Gounders, Gounders. And if you go back to pre-1980, the Gounders were landowners, farmers in a cotton-growing region. And as a result of many things, many movements globally, and also locally, as in local economic, say, changes, like subsidies given to those who might grow cotton and so on, move into the textile industry, this particular caste, as a group, decided to move into the textile manufacturing sector. This was around the early 80s, before liberalisation in the early 90s. It's benefited that community immensely. The group has, the community has benefited immensely. Many of the former manufacturing plant holders, their wealth has increased as India has globalized, particularly in terms of textile manufacturing. These families, what they do now is, in order to now assert themselves in a different sort of India, they've moved up economically, they've moved up in terms of social capital, the connections they have to business and political infrastructure through both Tamil Nadu and federally. They need cultural capital, right? I'm just sort of simplifying the story, and what they've done en masse is send their kids overseas to elite English, often English, universities for education in business management, maybe in textile management as well, both men and boys and girls, off to university, often in England, and come back. Now the boys themselves come back and enter the family business, but for women, the consumption of education in India has been seen as, it's talked about here as well, at this university, is seen as a certificate for entry into marriage, right? So the different education pathway, the same education pathway, maybe a BCom in a British university or a Bachelor of Science in textile manufacturing, is used for different purposes, conveys different meanings to those who actually hold it. For guys, it tends to be, okay, you're going back into the family business with your new knowledge. For women, it's, oh, you've got the certificate that now enables you to become more marriageable, right? And that's one way through which this caste has been able to move up in terms of economic, not just social, but also cultural capital, right? And that's what I mean by this middle classedness is marked by continuities, right? Because even though there are transformations within the group, within the family, within the community, there are still linkages to, in inverted commas, older values like family and so on, or the places of women. Now that of course is changing, as we'll see in the next slide, but I just wanted to bring that up. An interesting way through which the consumption of education has transformed economically, socially and culturally these communities, but then there are still linkages with the old as they move forward. Just in the next couple of minutes, I want to talk around the idea of imagery, right? Now this is sort of moving into my sort of particular terrain as well. I'm an advertising researcher. but I want to talk about the power of imagery, and we sort of know this inherently as well. The power of imagery to shape consumer taste, to, as the second point there says in black, to constrain, prohibit, maybe allow particular behaviors and morals, right? And for all of us, we all belong to consumer, what people call consumption communities. We all have then our peers often, as in consumer psychology, we talk about this idea of social or consumer reference groups. Often they're our peers, right? Maybe our family, right? These act as critiquing collectives as well, right? So they are there to sort of police your behavior and make sure you don't stray too far from it. So I'm just, sorry, I don't know if you can read that last point. The last point there I put there is when people move, and now this is, it occurs in Australia as well, when people move through the classes, when they become more socially mobile, there's a moment through which they have to keep readjusting, right, to the new, as I put there, the new status games, the new practices, the new ways of using goods and services and brands, right? And we see this quite a bit. I mean, the research I mentioned before about alcohol consumption in Delhi is an interesting one because we're focusing on those who are moving from rural India to Delhi itself, and the sort of practices or the shifts in practices and the shifts in understandings about brands that they formerly used, and now that they're in Delhi, the ways that they have to adjust to the new ways, the new brands that are valorized or legitimized here in this city amongst their collectives here, as opposed to the ones back home. So this is Starbucks, right? It's both instructive, but it's also celebratory as well, if you can see. My late to work, and I love it, cappuccino, right? But at the same time, as it's sort of instructive, it's teaching people about the world of work, what brands to use, how to use brands, but it's also celebratory. Can someone tease out why it might be celebratory? Anyone? Do you sense a celebratoriness in there?
It's just weird that like she's celebrating being late to work. I don't know, but
Yes. Celebratory in that sense. There's a sense of assertiveness.
She was able to like buy like a Starbucks, which is like an American brand. It's like the height of like what coffee is in India.
That's right. That's one aspect of that celebratoriness. The other is actually pushback against the authority of the structures of work. Female, if you, I don't know if you've been reading the press here. I mean, gender relations here are fascinating to watch. Gender relations are fascinating. And here we have, in a moment when Indian women are starting to emerge, and you can actually argue around the world this is happening as well, you know. So, but here it takes on particular nuances. There are particular histories around the role of women. And so you have this sort of celebratoriness around that, you know.
It's just like, but I mean, I get that. Like, you know, like yes, she's working and like against authority, but it's just like, why would a company like Starbucks or like in general, when you're like promoting someone going to work, celebrate being late to work? Like in general, like forget gender.
Okay, so
I don't get it.
she can afford, there's a certain, she can afford, I mean, it's assumed that she's not going to be told off by her boss because she's late. She can afford, she's got the sort of authority or the assertiveness there, or perhaps achieved, you know, a certain level of
Ranking, like a position within.
that's right, yeah. Oops, I'm just going to, in the last couple of minutes, I'm going to show you this one from, which one am I going to show? Okay, here's one I found interesting. This is from Apple, if I can bring it up. all 4 of them.
We know how hard it is to wait for something special, which is why we offer our prices on easy EMI.
Again, let me go back to the slide here. Oops. So what things are going on there in terms of, and bringing the discussion back to the Indian middle class and some of the ideas we've talked about, what things can you see going on in there? What was that?
A wedding.
Okay, yes, obviously it's a wedding, but what is, I want some other deep analysis, what's going on. I know it's lunchtime. Sorry? Massive part, yes.
Another thing is the
I'll just, so massive part of Indian culture, yes.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say the bride is not supposed to show her face.
The bride is not supposed to show her face, right? But there's a way that this is now played out through
Through
technology, right? Anything else?
We explored a few features of the iPhone itself, like from a technical point of view.
Yes. I mean, it has to do that as well. Talk about the brand and perhaps what it can do, but embed all of that within this little 1 minute, 60-second narrative featured around a central structuring Indian cultural value, the Indian family. But it's a wedding of a particular sort. Just one last point.
Just like in the Starbucks ad, how it was like a person from a higher kind of class.
Yep.
It represents a higher class where they can afford an iPhone and massive wedding and beautiful
Yeah.
jewelry.
There's a sense of aspiration as well, not just with the phone, but with the backdrop within which the phone's inserted, right? The wedding. And here's another one. I'm just going to show you. This one is Mercedes-Benz. Just one click.
Our country has always been gifted by intelligence. Intelligence for a higher purpose. Introducing the all-new E-Class.
Sorry, can you see?
Higher intelligence. Displayed in a revolutionary cockpit with steering-mounted touchpad. Amazing Burmeister surround sound. Intelligent drive. Air body control that feels like a gentle glide. And the first luxury saloon to offer reclining rear seats with memory function. So you have the finest E-Class ever. The all-new Mercedes-Benz E-Class. A masterpiece of intelligence. Our country has always
Sorry.
Just as a side note, they are really nice to drive, right?
So again, I mean, similarly an aspirational brand, of course, but what else could we see in there?
A show for driving.
Yes. I'm glad you picked that up because that was, yes. But
It wasn't in, like, it didn't look like it was in, like, a traditional Indian, like, setting.
right. Yes. Yes.
It was super clean.
Yeah.
Super clean.
Super clean.
And I was like, it was like there was no females. It was like just it was probably a targeted gender.
Well, yes, that's right. I mean, there are, yes, yeah, that's right. It's part of a series of television commercials, and they are heavily skewed toward the male professional audience. Anything else?
Well, it's interesting how unlike car ads in other countries where they primarily target towards the driver and the owner of the car at the same time, here you saw a lot more emphasis on like having a driver who drives you and like spending more time in the rear seat than in the front.
Yes,
So
yes.
you rarely see that in Western ads.
Yes. Yes. No, again, I mean, going back to the idea of...
Even like the car itself, E-Class usually is targeted towards like an individual owner without having a driver as like a more of a middle class car in Europe or in the US. As here, well, big families are clearly like an upper class.
If you're an architect, working at such a similar practice, then you can afford a chauffeur-driven car, for example. Anything else?
Yeah.
One last one? Two last ones then? Three? Okay. Yep, go on.
Okay. I think in India, like providing like the best like life for your kid is so important, and like being able to like provide them with the best thing, best facility. So that's why like they showed and they love like boy child, like male child. So like showing like a young guy like really enjoying this car like,
Yes.
was super important.
Yes.
As well.
No, you've touched on something really important here, particularly around Indian masculinity. Boy children, yes, as we sadly know, boy children are legitimized, in a way that, it's a deeply structuring value, and yeah.
I was
Going to say the same thing.
similar thing about like family and children.
Okay, I'm going to press on, and just I put this here if we had time to talk. I had hoped you guys might have actually. Has anyone done any of the readings for any of the seminars? Oh my gosh. Okay. All right. So I was going to talk about glocal yoga. Anyone heard of the term glocalization? Yes. Yes. Okay. Cool. So, in a nutshell, if you're interested in how things are occurring in India, what I really like about this article, and this is from two extremely high-profile consumer researchers globally. Actually, Gianna Eckert wrote her first beautiful paper when she was at UNSW in 2008, and she's gone on from there. She's now either an associate prof or full prof at Royal Holloway, University of London. But what I like about this paper is that they focus on a cultural practice that originated in this part of the world, the Indian subcontinent, called yoga, of course. But look at the movements out of India, in a sense, to the developed West, and then reincorporated back in, and how those meanings have changed of what yoga is about over that development. So, for example, so my second point there is yoga from the 1890s onward has been repositioned in the West away from an Indian spiritual practice, philosophically driven, because those philosophies might be actually antithetical to those from the developing West, right? So it's been repositioned from the 1890s onwards through people like this Swami Vivekananda and others who were Indian spiritual gurus who were able to connect with the West and were a conduit, should I say, of spiritual thoughts and belief systems around yoga and transcendental meditation and so on, import those ideas devoid of the deeply philosophical meanings, import them into the West. But they were imported, particularly from roughly that period onwards, through the 20th century, with a focus on health and fitness. And more recently, what we're seeing is yoga being reappropriated, imported back into India, if that makes sense. The meanings of yoga are being brought back into India in ways that are quite different to their original permutation, right? For example, and I'm just going to talk, that's just an example of how the middle class now in India has taken up yoga, just one example should I say, how the middle class has taken up yoga as a health and fitness practice. But the beauty of this paper is that they actually tease out ways that it's not just about yoga. We could supplement that word for another cultural practice that, say, perhaps originated in this place, was taken abroad, right, over the last 100 years, and now because of the globalizing India and the emerging middle class within that globalizing India that wants to connect with a global discourse, right, how those ideas of yoga are being re-imported, if that's the word, imported back in. So for example, and this is just my last couple of minutes here before you guys head off for lunch. Yoga is seen as a tool for HRM, right? Just one way, for example. Strictly straight from, what's happening here, shouldn't say here, I keep doing that, what's happening in the developed West, for example, right? But it's also seen as a health practice and also a marketed and marketized health practice, right? That also has meanings around what we call global yoga, right? Here's another way that global yoga, this was the one intended for my Monash students, but you guys have the same thing, global yoga is there. It's seen as, okay, we're importing this Indian spiritual practice at Monash University, and you can de-stress by daily stress and increase well-being by working with posture, asana, breathing, whatever that one is, and relaxation, yoga, nidra, right? You guys have the same thing at in UNSW, right? That's global yoga. There's also a counter movement, which is, people see this as, people from here see it as, oh my God, these Westerners are actually taking our things and appropriating it. How dare they? So there's sort of this counter sort of view as well. And of course then we're seeing a re-emergence of yoga as a, well, this is prominent. That's very prominent. I mean, this picture, this sort of Narendra Modi leading the charge, it's very prominent. Yoga has, the meaning of yoga has been reworked now as a national cultural heritage practice. But that meaning doesn't come from directly its associations as a spiritual practice. It comes from those coming from the West. And they're trying to reclaim it, this guy here and his followers, right? So that sort of links in with, I think, your comment before, this links in with your comment before about how practices are brought in from outside, right? But some are actually, they move out of India, create different meanings here, or wherever it might be, and those meanings are then reinterpreted here, brought back in. And that's what we're seeing often with many of the consumption practices of the, I would say the more strongly culturalized, socialized, and economically resourced middle class. Now I'm going to leave it there. I know I've just run a couple of minutes over time. Just quickly, does anyone have any questions? You're all very hungry? Cool. I'll let you go. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.